So about 10:15.
Okay?
I think you said.
We'll see you then.
Okay.
Thank you. This interview with Miss Nina Miglionico is conducted on Friday, September 26th at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. Joining Miss Nina for the interview are Sam Rumore, her friend and law partner of many years, and Ed Lamont, professor of political science at Birmingham Southern College. Miss Nina, thank you very much for agreeing to conduct this interview, which I hope can be a spoken autobiography of your very interesting and important life. Would you begin by telling us the basics about your family, their coming to Birmingham, and your early years growing up in Birmingham?
Well, let me see what I can remember. My grandfather, on my mother's side, was in Birmingham in about 1890. But he came, stayed a couple of years, went back, came back a couple of years, and went back to Italy. My father came to the United States when he was about 16 years old. And as near as I can tell, it was about 1899 or 1900. He was a violinist, and he played in orchestras around the country, in hotels, for tea dances, little concerts, but he made his living as a violinist. And he went to South Carolina and Illinois, because I have letters that he's mailed to my mother when he was courting her in later years. So I know that that's the way he made his living. In Birmingham, we had the same type of thing, because in those days, the Tutwiler Hotel the old Tutwiler, had tea dances at 4 to 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And before people went home, I guess. Anyway, Mother and Daddy were married in 1912 in the old country. And that's the only time that I know he went back. Now, grandfather on Mother's side had a number of farms, and they practiced primogeniture, just like in England. So you couldn't divide your lands among 4 kids, and then 20 years later, you divide back. You know, you wouldn't have any farms. The mother had to sign when she got her dowry that she would not claim anything on grandfather's estate. And grandfather gave her $15,000 in 1912, which was a good sum of money. And Daddy was a citizen of the United States because he was 27 when he got married. So he had been in this country 11 years and had acquired citizenship before he married. So evidently, Mother's money paid for their trip back to the United States, paid for them to come to Birmingham. And why he came to Birmingham is he had an older brother that was a jeweler in Ensley. He had a shop there, and he had another brother that had married and lived in Ensley also, had married Mother's older sister, and also bought some property with her dowry. So Daddy evidently knew he could not make a living playing the violin. So he looked for property, and he bought a two-story building in Avondale. Now in 1913 or 12, Avondale had been a part of Birmingham only 3 years, when the merger went. So evidently Daddy bought the building with mother's money. It was a two-story building, and he had a store, kind of a 7-Eleven type, a delicatessen type thing. And then they had a home upstairs. What did he sell? I think he had an ice cream soda parlor. I think he sold hot dogs. Also had candy for kids. He had Sundays. I remember that he carried shirts for working men, safety gloves, neckerchiefs, that type of thing. He also had canned goods, but nothing perishable. In those days you had to have ice brought to you every day. And that's the way that he started. Evidently he knew he couldn't make a living playing the violin, but at night he would play the violin when we were growing up. So that is that. Now, from Avondale started right where the U.S. Pike, I think it is, on 28th Street or something, but there were frame houses all the way from 28th Street on up to 85th Street in Birmingham. Just a little Avondale, Woodlawn, Eastlake. They were just two-story, one-story houses. The mill village was in Avondale, Culver Mills. And they had housing for the employees between 1st and 5th Avenue. But it was just nice people with porches because you didn't have radio and television. You stood on your porch and talked. And that went on forever. And they had a good transit system. The streetcars ran all the time, Now, I remember going to, I also remember that I was a bride and had no knowledge of English. So, Daddy spoke English, Mother spoke Italian, and we grew between them. We became bilingual in no time flat. And then when I got to be 7, we went to grammar school at Cunningham, which was 8th Avenue North or something like that, where Grayson Lumber Company was, Carson Railroad track. And he would take me and my brother up what is now Messer Boulevard going to the airport, and up 39th Street, up the hill to Grayson Lumber Company. And the school was across the railroad tracks. Dr. John Bryan, who served with me on the city council, was my first principal. And I remember that for the first 3 or 4 months of 1920, there was a young Italian girl that had come over with an American soldier, and she spoke no English, and she was a war bride. And so she was trying to learn English, and they put her next to me in the 1st grade. And I was supposed to translate for her. She stayed about 3 months and left because actually I'm sure people made fun of her. And in those days I knew more Italian than I do now, But anyway, I remember that we had a strong curriculum, and the teachers were mostly old ladies. And I remember that there was one or two younger ladies, but they didn't stay very long because when you got married, you had to quit. You couldn't stay in the school system. So you either had them quite young or quite mature. But the teachers were fantastic. And I remember that they were always kind, but they made you do the mark. There was no playing around. I don't remember any lunchrooms in the school system, and I don't remember how we got lunch. But as far as the Italians were concerned, they weren't that many. There were the Lasusas and the Sabatinis on Fifth Avenue. There were the Malays on about, 37th Street, somewhere along there. There were the Gallianos on 43rd or 44th. And the Mussos, and then the Baldonis on a piece of land between us and the Messer Boulevard, you know. And they all ran small stores. And as far as relations being Italian or anything of this kind, the only thing I remember is that once, one of the school teachers said to me, "You certainly do come to school clean to be an Italian." When I told Mother, she just absolutely cried, you know. But that's the only thing I remember, except that Daddy took us to school because there was no buses. And we were like the Pied Piper, you know, we'd start out with 2 kids, you get 4 or 6. By the time you got to school, there'd be 14 or 15 playing around together. And Daddy couldn't make it. The policemen, they were walking policemen, and they knew everybody. You couldn't sin because they were there. And the policemen knew people. I remember that one day at 2 in the morning, the lights upstairs were all on. And the policeman knocked on the door and said, "Mr. Joe, what's wrong?" And Daddy said, "Well, Mama's sick." But the policeman knew something was wrong. When Daddy couldn't take us to school, the policeman somehow was there to marshal us there. It was just a quiet, village-type existence. You know, people knew each other, watched out over each other. And basically, I don't remember any trouble with anybody being ugly. You know.
And then after Cunningham School, what was your further education?
What?
Where did you go after Cunningham School?
Oh, Woodlawn High. And we rode the streetcar to Woodlawn High School. But before, let me see, that would have been about, 1926. And before that, Mother's 2 brothers, who had graduated from the musical university in Naples, Italy, came to visit her. And that's when the municipal auditorium was being inaugurated. And so they were asked to give a concert. My uncle Vincent played the violin. His brother accompanied him on the piano. They started me on the piano. You know, that's where I got my interest in music. Now, they didn't stay here but about 9 months. They gave lessons, and Mother's dining room became their teaching. And they taught violin, they taught piano for maybe a year, I don't remember exactly, but I remember that my grandfather on the mother's side got sick. And so the older brother, the violinist, had to go back. He was the oldest son. He had to go back to take care of the lands there. The younger brother went to Rhodesia and became president of the Conservatory of Music and stayed there maybe 30 or 40 years. And after that, I graduated and went to Woodlawn. We rode the streetcar to Woodlawn. I don't remember if it was a nickel or a dime to go. But the streetcars ran all the time. You never had any trouble. You know, they were always there. In Woodlawn, the teachers were just like Cunningham, except they were more male teachers. The male teachers taught biology and science, things of that kind. But the older teachers, I had 4 years of Latin, 2 years of French at Woodlawn. I had 3 years of math. I had English literature, American literature. I had American history, English history. I had civics. It was a strong curriculum. Now, I don't remember not being part of the group. I don't remember any particular discrimination of any kind, except the French teacher once said to me, "Why do you keep telling people you're Italian? Why don't you tell them you're French?" And that was the one thing I remember about a statement.
What was it like being a teenage girl in Birmingham during that time period? Other than school, what kinds of things did you do?
Lessons from Abigail Crawford. And interestingly enough, Hugh Thomas was taking music from Miss Abigail Crawford at the same time. And oh, I'm sorry. And just a beautiful lady. She used to live in Decatur, Alabama, but she had studied in Paris and in Vienna. And she was like all the teachers in those days. She didn't only teach piano, but whenever we were playing Mozart, she would talk about Salzburg. And you would just know she loved Salzburg and Vienna. I mean, she talked about the composers. When she talked about when your mother thought he was a brother, I mean, she gave of herself. You know, she didn't even teach you piano. She taught you life. She taught you what genius could do. She just loved those composers. And so what we did was go take piano lessons a couple of times a week, go to ballet and take dancing, and then go to the library, things of this kind. Well, so it was work. And you came home and did your homework with your papa and mama supervising and doing it for you.
I'd like just to read what you gave me. 2 invitations to recitals, The invitations are from the Abigail Crawford Studios. The first inviting to a recital by Miss Nina Miglionico, assisted by a string ensemble for a program on Friday evening, 24th, 1931, at the Cable Building, 1816 3rd Avenue. And the second is an invitation for an event on May 7th, 1932, piano recital with Miss Nina Miglionico, Mr. Hugh Thomas, who became our legendary director of choirs at Birmingham Southern and a noted musician in our community and in our country, and Mr. Gordon Moon.
And Gordon became an FBI agent and was in Denver, Colorado.
And so clearly you had a promising career as a pianist.
Well, when I graduated from college, I had the option to go to the University of St. Louis, in St. Louis, with a scholarship in music. I decided to do something different.
And what did you decide to do?
Well, I went to Howard College. Oh, that was after college.
Well, so you graduated then from Woodlawn High School, and the next step was to go to Howard College.
And we went on the streetcar.
Were you living in the same house all of these years? Did you and your family live in the same house in Avondale?
Absolutely.
And can you say some about the Howard College years?
Well, it was a Baptist college, and you knew it. And they had a rule that if you were not of that denomination, you didn't have to go to assembly. You didn't have to take Bible. But I decided I wanted to take Bible, so I took Bible under L.O. Dawson, from which the Dawson Memorial Church. And he took a great deal of pride in me all the time. So we had a big time in class. But whenever he was joking, whenever he was going at me, I knew he didn't mean it. I liked him a lot. I think he liked me. So it was a Baptist school. Again, they had a fantastic faculty. They had Dr. Mason who taught English literature. They had Miss Poet that taught American literature. They had Dean Burns that taught Shakespeare. And the curriculum, again, was terrific. I took 2 years of French, 2 years of Italian, 1 year of Shakespeare. I took a year of American history and English history, biology, economics, business administration. It was a strong curriculum, strong teachers. They were experts in their own field. Again, the women were mature. I think most of them were not married. And I graduated in 3 years by going to summer school. And
Miss Nina, who were some of your prominent classmates? Do you remember any of your prominent classmates?
Laura, not particularly.
What did you major in? What was your academic major?
I don't know if it was history or what. History and economics, I think, something like that.
But throughout these years, you continued to play the piano.
Oh, yeah. I played the piano in the orchestra at Howard.
And at this point in your life, what were your future plans, your career goals, or your aspirations?
Well, you see, my brother is a year younger than I am. And Mother was a protective hen. You know, she didn't mind you playing with kids as long as they were at your house. You know, she had to be sure you were safe. And, you know, they supervised everything. Like on Saturdays, we walked to the Avondale Library. And my brother was a big Indian. I mean, he just hooked up everywhere with his boys, you know. He was a wild Indian. And I remember Daddy telling the librarian that he was disturbed by John because he only read Wild West books. And she said to him, and I remember, says, "Don't worry, Mr. Joe, as long as he's reading, his taste will improve, you know." So, and my brother was a year behind me, or 2 years behind me, because I was double promoted all the time. And he went through things. He was going to be a policeman, then he was going to be a fireman, then he was going to be a math teacher. You know, whatever teacher got hold of him and his imagination centered on that teacher, that's what he was going to be. Then he became a lawyer, you know. Then he ended up being a surgeon. Yeah. And so I guess I stopped when he got to be a lawyer. Then I said, well, me too, you know. And that's the way it got started, I guess. And then Daddy said, forget it. You know, that's what you want. That's what you'll get.
Miss Nina, you have described growing up in the Avondale area. My understanding is that in the Ensley area, there is a very large population of Italians. Was there an Italian community that brought together Italians from throughout Birmingham?
There was Sons of Italy, I guess, and they'd have a big to-do on Columbus Day. And of course, you know, I'm glad you reminded me, because you know Father Coyle was murdered in 1921, but I don't remember any repercussions on that. But I do remember that the KKK across the street from our house was a drugstore in Dr. Murray. I don't know what he did, but they burned a cross in front of the drugstore. And my bedroom faced that side. And I woke up in the middle of the night with that cross burning. And I was so scared that when our home was in 1965, I called the fire department instead of the police department. I was so frightened with that. Also, I remember about 1923, because I must have been 9 or 10 years old, that about 12 KK people in their white regalia came into the store about 9 o'clock at night.
Your father's store?
Yeah. And they said, Mr. Joe, this must have been after Dr. Murray had the cross burn. He said, we want you to know that we are not going to harm you. You are a good man, and you do not send your children to Catholic school. And I was just a toddler. I could have been 8, but I know that I remember those men crowded around the front of the store.
So the Ku Klux Klan called on your father
In full regalia.
to compliment him for not sending you to Catholic school.
And you are a good man.
Mm-hmm. Can you say something about the church, the Catholic Church, and its importance in the Italian community and perhaps in your life and your family's life?
Well, it wasn't all it should have been. But we were Catholic, we went to church, but we didn't go to Catholic school. And so there were some Italian priests that came over from St. Mark's Church in St. Thomas and had dinner with us occasionally, maybe once a month. And the nuns came over and had lunch or dinner with the family. But as far as any rapport with the church proper, I don't remember anything particular. Of course, we went to Columbus Day, or whenever they had a big to-do, Daddy always went. At the time that I was playing the piano, I was always on the program. I always had to give them a free, piece. That's what you have to do,
So you graduated from Howard College, and the seed had been planted in your mind of becoming an attorney, and you were an accomplished pianist.
Not accomplished, no.
Well, you were, at least you were giving public presentations.
Yeah.
And so, what next?
What next?
Yeah.
Okay. Next, let me say this, that Daddy had bought the land next to him, and he had a dry place and a furniture store on First Avenue next to ours. So it was, about 5 stores, And also, let me say this, I do not remember that there were 2 entrances. There was one entrance for whites and blacks alike. And I don't remember any problems with that. Daddy had a soda fountain, like I said. And white people sat down at the tables, drugstore type things. But I don't remember any blacks sitting there. I remember blacks buying hot dogs and walking out. I remember the black children who went to Thomas School right there on 2nd Avenue, the Board of Education still uses the building. And the little kids about 3 o'clock would come in and they would buy candy for a penny. And I remember that when John was about 3 or 4 years old, we would wait on them and take their pennies and give them a candy, So, but where were we?
Well, but on that point of black children coming in,
Going to law school.
As you grew up, what contacts or awareness did you have of black children and the black community in Birmingham?
Well, I remember that Mother had black help. They took the laundry home with them. The sheets, the pillowcases, the heavy laundry. Then one black woman did the light laundry at home, in our home. I know that Daddy had a black woman that kept the store clean. And I know that from time to time she would wait on people. And nothing particular was said about it. And I remember that men in the neighborhood would come in, sit at the tables, drink a Coke or something because the 18th Amendment was there. Sunday didn't have any hard liquor. And they would talk, it was kind of like a neighborhood. They did what they did.
Would this be black and white men?
No blacks sitting.
No blacks sitting.
White people
You had
sitting.
said that before.
I remember another thing that to me was important. That during my years at Woodlawn, I think it was, that I remember that a man came into the store about 3 or 4 o'clock, and he says, "Mr. Joe, do you own the lot across the street?" And Daddy said, "Yeah." He says, "Well, is it for sale?" Daddy says, "Well, not particularly." He says, "Well, would you sell it? And Daddy says, sure. And he says, well, what would you take for it? Daddy says, well, I don't know. He says, well, I'll give you $12,500. Daddy says, well, that sounds pretty good. He says, well, can I bring you a contract tomorrow? Daddy says, okay. I remember that night, what happened was that one of the filling stations wanted that lot. And evidently word had gotten out because another salesman showed up that night. He said, Mr. Joe, do you own that lot on the street? Yeah. Is it for sale? Well, and he said, well, I want to buy it. And Daddy says, well, I agreed to sell it today. And the man said, for how much? He said, $12,500. Said, well, I'll give you 15. And Daddy says, well, I'm sorry. I can't sell it to you. And the man says, well, you said that the man's coming back tomorrow. Daddy says, that's correct. He says, you're not bound. And Daddy says, well, I gave him my word. And I've always remembered that, you know. But it boils down to this, that Daddy and the First National Bank were buddies. I mean, Daddy borrowed money all the time and never had any problems when he showed up to general persons. And in those days, the First National Bank, general persons sat right in the main lobby. And he knew the customers, which the CEOs today don't know. And so Daddy says, I want to borrow money. And the person's asked him, what are you going to do with it? He says, I'm sending my daughter to law school. He says, we're not giving you the money. He says, you're wasting it. She'll get married and never use it. And Daddy says, well, if I give her an education, nobody can take it away from her. But I leave her money, somebody can take it. General person says, no. Daddy had to go to the family lawyer, who became a probate judge later. And this gentleman went down to general persons and he got his money. But that was the attitude about higher education for women.
But you did go to law school. And what can you tell us about that experience?
Well, I can say, well, the University Law School admitted women in 1907, and the course took 1 year. And then in 1908, the second woman graduated. I think by the time that 33 came along, there'd been about 22 or 23 girls in those intervening 20 years or whatever. And so our class had 5 women, about 70 or 80 boys, maybe a few more. It was the first time that a university class had had more than 2 girls. And the professors were like everybody else. Some of them resented you. Some of them took you in stride. I remember that the criminal law professor, whenever they came to a rape case, asked us to leave the room. And another professor would announce, next lecture, we will hear from our beautiful young ladies. And so you knew the study for the next class, you know. And there were 5 girls, so he took you A, B, C, D, E. So you had to be stupid not to know which case you were going to be called on. So the next class, he would call on us. And when he was through with us, he would say, now aren't our young ladies brilliant? And the boys would hoop it up, you know. The other professors took us us in stride. They were gentlemen. They ignored you. They might have called on you once or twice a year. They called the boys maybe once a week. We got called when they remembered us. But I mean, we were just invisible, basically. And I played for the orchestra at the university. And Dean Farrell, who was quite the law's a jealous mistress, called me in my first year. And he says, "Is law hard for you?" And I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "But it can't be too hard." I said, "Oh, yes, it is." He says, "You've got time to play for the orchestra." So I got the message, and I was tired from the orchestra. He didn't think you had to have any outside activities because law schools take all your time. Also, in moot court, they assigned 2 boys to argue cases before the so-called judges in learning how to present a case. The girls became the third figure on that. We were never a boy and a girl. 2, like all the boys, we became the 3. So there were 5 3-sections in moot court. So we were just added on. And also, we had to go to the library in law school at night to study, carry on like that. I remember one of the young men in the class walked me home at 9 o'clock at night to the dormitory, and I had a little typewriter, little portable typewriter. He said, "Well, I would take the typewriter for you, but since you're going to take the bread out of my children's mouth, you can take it yourself." He wasn't married, he didn't have kids, but I was taking bread out of his children's mouth. Now, not all of the boys were like that. I made friends that after we graduated, we were strong friends through the years, you know.
You need to talk about some of your law school classmates.
Mm.
You need to talk about some of your law school classmates.
Judge Mize in Tuscaloosa, who was at the,
So, I was asking her about some of her law school classmates.
well, Mr. Jones from Florence became a congressman, Carl Elliott, who became a congressman, Beanie Mize, who was a judge in Tuscaloosa. Also, he was a senator, and he was a senator that passed a bill in Montgomery that unmasked the Klan. You know, he's the one that said you could not wear a mask. He was never elected again. You know, just like Charlie Nice here, you know. And the Wilbanks in Atlantic City, in Tallahassee. Oh, I can tell you one thing about race relations in law school. You know, University of Alabama had a football team. And if you lived in Birmingham, you were quite popular because they could come stay with you and then be free. You know, your family would feed them, things of this kind. So one of the young ladies from Tallahassee came to my house numbers of times. And we slept on the floor, you know, did everything like you did when you had a lot of company. She says to me one day, she says, you know, you certainly are nice to be Catholic. And I says, what in the world's the trouble? She says, how could you drink the blood of babies in your communion? And I says, why in the heck did you hear that? And she says, well, everybody knows it. And I says, well, honey, it ain't true. So, you know, it's always an undercurrent, but people are nice, evidently they don't talk about it.
There were some other classmates. What about Mel Allen? Wasn't he one of your classmates?
Who?
Mel Allen?
No.
How about Elton Stevens?
Who?
Elton
Stevens.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Elton Stevens. Mr. Levine in Birmingham. But we had, I think 3 congressmen out of the class. It was a good class, but the boys were somewhat older.
What did the women wind up doing? You said you had 5
Oh,
girls
yeah.
in your class.
Well, one of them was Irene Fagan from the famous Fagan political family in Alabama. She ended up in Washington on the tax court of the United States. And you know, she came down to Florida when we got back. Then Sarah Mae Hammond married a couple of generals in Washington, and she worked for the, I don't remember what department. And then Catherine McDuff from Tuscaloosa, her father was the sheriff of Tuscaloosa County. And she ended up, I think, in the Labor Department. And she was in Washington and then was in London for a time, but then came back to Tuscaloosa. But my big buddies later were Elizabeth Johnson Wilbanks and Sam Wilbanks. They ended up in Alex City. When they got married, they said that they had a bed and a table and 2 chairs. You know, they started out poor. But in a small town, you know, the big companies had to have a local attorney when they're fighting a case. So they were involved as local attorneys. And because they were good, they got better and better. And Sim, once with the Southern Railway, said to the president, who evidently came down for a very important case, he said, you certainly are stupid. And the man says, why? He says, you're taking all these Birmingham law firms, paying them big money, and then settling the cow case for $10,000 that you could have settled for $500 at the very beginning. And says, it's just stupid. The man took that to heart, and so he says, well, later, he says, we want you on our staff. I don't remember if it was St. Louis or where. So Sam went on the staff. He ended up a vice president of Southern Railway. And he was sent all over Europe to do work for him. And Sam was kind of funny. Everywhere he wanted his own bed. So he bought a home in England, bought a home in Spain, bought a home on the, not the islands, I can't think of the islands outside.
Canary Islands?
Not the Canaries.
Azores? The Azores?
Where the planes hit.
The Azores?
Huh?
The Azores?
No. Where's my mind? But anyway, that leads up to the fact that years later, I have gotten out of law school, but it's years later, Elizabeth showed up at my home one Sunday afternoon. Well, let me go back a little. When their kids were 8 or 9, they decided they wanted to learn Spanish. So Elizabeth called the ambassador of Mexico in Washington and says, can you arrange for us to have 2 Mexican children? And we're going to send our children to Mexico, and we'll be glad to take their children the next year on a reciprocal basis. And the ambassador says, well, my brother-in-law is a doctor in Mexico City. I'm sure he would like to have your kids. So Elizabeth and Sam flew out there, like the family. And so the children went to Mexico and learned Spanish. The next year, the 2 kids were supposed to come over here. So Elizabeth shows up at my doorstep on Sunday, out from Eric City, and she says, I'm in trouble. And I says, what's the matter? She says, the school board wants to send those 2 children to black schools. And they're the nephew and niece of the ambassador. I said, you better tell the school board they're in trouble. So they let the kids go to white school. But they had that arrangement for maybe 5 or 6 children. So, but what I'm getting at is that I went to England with her maybe for 10 summers and stayed a couple of weeks in their home. And that was just really learning the English. But we were very, very close.
And when you were in law school, what were your plans for your career after graduation, and what did you do after you graduated?
Well, to be very frank, I thought I would sit in the library and do research for a law firm. I never thought I would try a case. I never thought I would have a mind. I just thought that I would be a little maiden lady in the library doing research. I knew I was good at research, but when I went around looking for jobs, nobody could have cared less that I had a law degree. They said, well, can you type? A little bit. Type shorthand? Well, if you learn shorthand, we'll give you $15 a week. That didn't sound so hard. And I was teaching music in the summers, and then after I got out of law school, I also had pupils that I taught at home. And so I wasn't that pressured. Then accidentally, I met Robert Gordon. He ended up having one of the biggest law firms in the city. And in those days, he was just out. So he says to me, he had one office, one reception room, one private office in the master room. He says, I'm not making a living, but you're welcome to come in and help me not make a living. So that sounded pretty good. So I said, okay. And so I stayed with him for maybe, 10, 15 years. But we ended up that whenever he got a client, he sat in the private room. When anybody came to see me, I sat in the private room. We had no secretaries. After a couple of years, we hired one and paid half each. Later on, we each got a secretary. You start. And so you have to build up law practice. And the first 6 months that I practiced, I made $72 gross and $72 net.
That was an unusual arrangement in Birmingham at the time, was it, to have a partnership
Well, a partnership
or
just that you
a
wouldn't get.
collaboration?
We became partners later, but it wasn't
Right.
at that time. And so, how did I build up a practice? Just like you do with men. You join clubs to so you can get an audience. And I joined the Business and Professional Women. I joined the University Women. I joined the Federation of Women's Clubs. And see, 1920 was when women first got vote. And see, we're talking of 1936, 37. So women were just beginning to be interested in who they were. Most of them didn't vote. The club movement was just beginning to flourish, and it was just mushrooming. I mean, clubs grew up all over the place. And of course, you need speakers. If they're free, they're wanted. So I was free, and I was wanted. And I had topics that they needed to know about. So I could talk about wills, I could talk about laws that, you know, a wife couldn't sell her property, that she couldn't do this if a lady married. And no, if a lady made a will before marriage and then married, her will was null and void. In those days, a number of young ladies had mothers that they were taking care of. And so, when they went on their honeymoon, even if they had a will and died on the honeymoon, the will wouldn't be good. So, they had to come and sign the will after they got married. So many of them came to the office, we drew up a will, then they had to get married on Saturday. After they got married, they came to our home, signed a will, and then went on to the honeymoon to be sure that their parents were protected, you know, that type of thing. And from making lots of speeches, you know, people would come in and say, well, I read your name in the paper, and you were talking about a will, so maybe you know something about them, so you make me one. You know, so you build up a practice. And men sometimes came to you because they thought you were cheaper. And when you gave them for $15 or $25, you know, a lease or something, well, you charge the same thing my man does. And I said, well, Mr. Massey doesn't give me a discount. And neither does Alabama Power. Well, just be quiet, you're worthy. You know. But it was always that feeling that you ought to be a little bit cheaper. Yeah.
So during this time, you are practicing law and
Teaching music.
And you continued to teach music for a good number of
Maybe
years?
about 3 years.
Mm-hmm. And then it became full-time law.
Well, it was full-time law because I taught music at night and on Saturday.
Right. And you and Mr. Gordon were together for, you said about?
From 37 to what, 67?
Really? There were many things happening during that period of time. Some in Birmingham, I'm thinking of, for example, the Brown versus Board of Education case and some of the emerging activities that later evolved into the civil rights movement. Were these things that you were aware of and participated in any way? Or did they have an impact on your life?
Well, Ed, in the period before the Civil Rights Movement, the Joint Legislative Council of Alabama was a group of about 20 or 30 organizations that pooled their resources together to get laws passed. You know, they were interested in jury service for women. They were interested in the poll tax being removed because you had to pay poll tax from the year that you were 21 until 45, $1.50 a year. And it was cumulative, so that if you voted after 10 years, you had to pay $15. Well, women didn't have $15 to waste on poll taxes when they had kids, you know. And then the prison system was a disgrace. You know, there was a lot of trouble with prisoners being beaten up, being raped. Women prisoners were in the same prison with men. You know, it was a bad system. The voting wasn't clean. Every time I voted, they put a number on my ballot. You know, your name on the sheet was 65. They would put 65 on your ballot so they could trace how you voted. The labor unions were interested in labor laws. And so men and women together would go down to Montgomery to argue with Governor Folsom about the prison system. You know, with other governors about various things, always about some of these issues that everybody was interested in.
I think we should stop because he said 1 hour, and he said this had 1 hour. Let me,
You need to take a break? You want to go to the restroom or anything?
Just want to get finished.
okay, I'll get him.
Well, I'm going to take a break to the restroom.
Okay.
You did fine. This is great. This is wonderful. Oh, me. Wow. A lot of reminiscing. A lot of reminiscences.
Yeah.
I tell you. I see you're holding your leg out of you. Is your leg hurting? Do you need a cushion or something? You need a...
No, my toe gets on top of the other.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I'm going to go to the restroom for a second.
There's one right up here. How did that go? How did it go?
I have no idea.
Well, that's good then.
What we could do is we could just